I think a lot of people who aren't involved in the sport a lot and they just come in and they're like base training and they see all this zone 2 stuff all everywhere, all over the internet. They're like, okay, and it's talked about a lot in the build phase. So building that foundation or building the foundation to the house, for example, is a good analogy for it before you put the roof on and all that sort of stuff and you build the inside. But if you don't maintain it throughout the whole season, then essentially you don't lose it, but essentially it starts to deteriorate and you can use it in a different way rather than just building the foundations.
So how would it look then? So let's just say you've done 12 weeks of base training, you focus mainly on zone 2 and you start transitioning to a high intensity plan. In order to maintain base fitness and incorporate in your training, how would it look week to week?
Yeah, so in a base training phase, you may be doing four out of your 5 sessions at an endurance pace or zone 2 pace where you're riding nice and easy. One other day of the week, you might be doing some intervals where you're pushing yourself. When you get into high intensity phase, the misconception that I get quite often is that I just need to do high intensity. I need to ride harder in my zone 2 and when I'm doing my intensity because I'm pushing myself essentially all the time. But if you're riding hard all the time, you overtrain. You start getting fatigued after a 4 to 6 week high intensity block, for example. Yep. So it's really important for that zone 2, and it's not just zone 2 training. So a lot of, again, people think I'm just doing zone 2 to improve my aerobic adaptation or build the foundation. Zone 2 is essentially recovery as well.
Right. Provided it's not a 5-hour zone 2 ride.
Exactly.
Yeah. So like 1 to 2 hours, depending on the athlete, kind of.
100%. Yeah. So it's depending on how hard you're doing your zone 2. So you're recovering in a zone 2 ride. Your top end energy system is recovering. Your fast twitch muscle fibers aren't contributing much to a zone 2 ride. So slow twitch muscle fibers, your glycogen stores, your autonomic nervous system in a proper zone 2 ride where you stay below your LT1 or your top end zone 2.
What's LT1?
Lactate threshold 1. When you do a lactate threshold test, it's that first inflection point.
Yep.
And then lactate 2, LT2 is your lactate threshold.
Okay.
So that's a typical point where you start going over, you start accumulating lactate more than it's being consumed.
Okay, and what's the disadvantage? Let's just say you're doing a zone 2 ride during your high intensity interval training phase and you go with a mate and he loves to just ramp it up the hills 500 watts, but your zone 2 is say 200 watts. And you go with him and then you coast down the other side, you're not really pedaling, and then the next hill he smashes it up for a minute and you follow him again. And basically you're in and out of lactate the whole time. Yeah, you do a bit of zone 2 riding, but it's kind of disrupted. So what happens if you do that? Because that's very common.
It's very common, yeah. And there's a big training effect there, and it takes a while to learn how to do a proper zone 2 ride, especially on undulating terrain. The negative of that is that you're not achieving the goal at all. So whenever you go above that zone 2, your whole physiology changes. So you start recruiting glycogen as an energy source, you use your fast twitch muscle fibers, you start producing adrenaline, all your hormones change because your body thinks, I need all the energy I can get because I'm going hard. You bump out of using fat as an energy source and predominantly use glycogen. So it takes a while for your body to switch back to what you were doing in an aerobic session. So it may take 15, 20, 25 minutes for your body to get back into that aerobic adaptation.
So if you've punched up a hill again in that 20-minute period, you're...
Add another 20 minutes on and
So the aerobic adaptation is disrupted and I guess you're adding more fatigue.
You still get an aerobic adaptation and you're still getting an endurance adaptation there, but you're still adding fatigue. You're adding unnecessary fatigue that your body doesn't want and it doesn't need for that particular session. So yes, it's all aerobic, and if you do 500 watts and then 100 watts downhill for a 3-hour period, then you're getting an aerobic adaptation. But the goals of that zone 2 or zone 1, 2, riding easy is not purely, but you're trying to increase your fat metabolism, you're trying to increase your mitochondrial biogenesis, you're trying to increase your fat max, and you're trying to make sure that your slow twitch muscle fibers start to develop more than fast twitch muscle fibers, for example, or make sure your fast twitch muscle fibers are recovering because they're not working as much. As soon as you go uphill hard, they're recruited, they get fatigued.
Yes.
And then the next session, day later, you can't push as hard, and that's why. because you're not recovering in that zone 2 session.
So what do you tell to your mate who's smashing it up the hill?
Grab his jersey pocket, pull him back.
Okay, right. Or in some cases, you're better off going solo, or the indoor trainer's a great place to do zone 2 rides as well.
Yeah, 100%. Like the constant pressure.
Yep. Yeah.
Constant pressure scenario is really important, and we were talking about this off camera, is that zone model, if we're looking at it from a scientific perspective, the zone 1, 2, they're in a scientific model in a zone 3. So 1, 2 is zone 1, 3, 4 is zone 2, 5, 6 is zone 3. And when we're looking at a lactate power curve. Zone 1 and 2, they're essentially the same. You're getting very similar adaptations riding in zone 1 and 2. So if you look at a time in zone model and, for example, you do a 2-hour base training ride and you spend an hour in zone 1 and you spend 45 minutes in zone 2. Where did you spend the time in zone 1? Was it in that top 5% of zone 1? So you're still pedaling. Your heart rate time was all in zone 2. So I didn't spend all my time in zone 1. So it's that constant pressure scenario isn't I'm constant pressure in zone 2, I'm constant pressure at 70% of threshold. Yes, that is really good. And yes, that's what we want to aim to achieve. But if you're riding at 60% of threshold, you're still getting a very similar adaptation there.
Yes.
Are you freewheeling on a downhill doing 20% of threshold for 2 minutes? Your heart rate goes into zone 1. What's the point?
Okay.
So that constant pressure scenario is really important to maintain that aerobic adaptation throughout the ride.
Yep. Okay. So you're doing constant pressure. You're in top end zone 1, bottom end zone 2, maybe top end zone 2. You're getting your zone 2 rides correct. Where do you place them into a high intensity interval training block? Because we've done the base training phase. We want to maintain aerobic fitness during high intensity. Let's just say you're riding, 5 to 6 days a week. What does your week look like?
So on a 7-day week from Monday to Sunday, typically you would do 2 days where it's pretty chill. So either resting, full day off the bike where you're focusing on recovery, extra sleep, all that sort of stuff, or you go for an active recovery ride or a coffee ride. Roll to the coffee shop, have a coffee, roll home.
Just don't go riding with your competitive mate on a coffee ride. Yeah.
Well, you don't go over zone 2. So you want to keep your heart rate low, you want to keep your autonomic nervous system recovering and just let it relax. Just if you have no pressure on the pedals and it feels really easy, perfect, you've nailed it. On those 2 days are really important, and I like to bookend the week with those. So the bookend the working week, because we typically work with people who have full-time jobs.
Monday to Friday.
Monday and Friday,
sorry. Yep.
Monday and Friday, it can change, so Thursday to Saturday or Thursday to Sunday, for example. But you want to do like a 3-day block and a 2-day block, or a 2-day, 3-day. So that's kind of the ideal situation. So you can do 3 days solid, recover, another 2 days solid, recover.
Okay.
In that 3 days, for example, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, if you're in a high intensity interval training block, I would typically do Tuesday and Thursday where you're doing some intervals. Yep. You're not going to do VO2 max intervals every day or of all of in your high intensity intervals period. You're not going to do VO2 in all of them. You might do threshold, or you might do sub-threshold, or it depends what you're trying to improve. A variation.
Yep.
But on that Wednesday, it's really important after an intense session to recover. So if you're doing Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday intensity sessions and then Saturday, Sunday as your easy rides, those 3 days are very fatiguing and you may recover in them, but how's the quality in those 3 sessions? So quality might be great Tuesday, pretty good Wednesday, you might get a good session. Thursday, you're probably going to suffer and you're probably not going to hit your power numbers because you've done intensity those 3 days. So how do you improve the quality of that Thursday session? Have an easier Wednesday.
Yep.
So just chill, zone 1, 2, nice and easy. You can still go reasonably long. So 2 to 3 hours is okay. If you've got time, 1 to 2 hours is good as well. But the important thing is that you're not stressing those fast twitch muscle fibers, your glycolytic system, your autonomic nervous system is getting some recovery and relaxation.
Yep, okay. And then Saturday and Sunday?
Saturday and Sunday, you would do one hard bunch ride, for example, or interval or race, and then Sunday you would do a longer endurance zone 2 ride.
Yeah, okay.
You don't want to go too. You can go hard both days, depending on how much time you've got and how much recovery and how you're responding to that. But if you're doing... Some people do a club race Saturday and Sunday, for example, but their overall time is they do 3 to 4 hours both days. So if you look at the distribution of how much time they're spending in each zone, then you're getting a pretty good you're getting 3 hours, for example, each day in zone 2, where working on that aerobic system, and you might get an hour of intensity.
Okay.
But it's important to recover on Monday. Make sure you're recovering.
Yes.
And make sure it doesn't affect your Tuesday session.
Okay.
So that's where it comes into talking to your coach and say, I did two hard sessions, Saturday, Sunday, and I suffered on Tuesday. Well, just change the Sunday session around, make it more of recovery.
Yep, okay. Strategically, that example, and this happens with a lot of people, they've got a 3-hour ride and only an hour is at intensity because they're meeting a mate or they're doing a race or something like that. Where are they best off putting the 2 hours of zone 2 training in that 3 hours? At the start or after?
It depends what your goal is. If you want to get some fatigue resistance out of it, which is becoming really a really important scientific research now. So a lot of top end researchers are looking into how fatigue resistance happens, and the difference between amateur and elite athletes is that fatigue resistance. So after a 3-hour ride or 4-hour ride, they can do the same power as they can at the start. So if you're trying to improve that, then do it at the end.
Okay.
If you want to get really good quality out of it and you want to really push yourself to get the best power possible, then do it at the start.
Okay.
It also depends how fit you are. So if you can't do a 3-hour ride and you go and do 2 hours base training and then do intervals at the end, they're going to be terrible quality.
Okay.
So looking at how much quality do you want to get out of that session?
Okay.
Are you doing a 5-hour race with a hard effort at the end of it? Then probably want to do your efforts at the end because that's what you need to do in your race. So talking about specificity and if you've got a goal.
Okay.
So that also determines what you're going to do.
Okay. The last question on, maintaining this aerobic engine during high intensity training, which is very important. What about replacing your hard Saturday ride, bunch ride, race, whatever it is, with a long zone 2 ride for 4 or 5 hours? Because you get fatigue out of that, and you really get to continue, top up the aerobic base engine, but does that disrupt the high intensity that you might have planned?
If that's really fatiguing for you, you haven't fueled properly, you're not used to 4 or 5 hours, then if you have a race on Sunday, for example, that's going to be quite hard. So doing zone 2 for a long period of time is fatiguing. So that zone 2 or base training is fatiguing in a particular way.
Yes.
It's not fatiguing in the sense that your muscles are going to be really sore from working above threshold, or you're depleting your glycogen stores to empty. You still are depleting all of that, but it's very different in the sense that I can do it for 2 hours and I'll be fine the next day. Whereas if you go 4 or 5 hours, that's pretty hard regardless.
It's definitely hard, and I know it's something that we've added to, because you're coaching me at the moment, and in my high intensity interval training block, we have done some longer zone 2 specific rides, and I've found them to be really beneficial because they've helped really top up the aerobic engine, but it's also that variability in your training. Yes, I'm fatigued, but it's a different fatigue, so that going to the following week, I've perhaps got a bit more freshness for some of those high intensity interval training sessions.
Yeah. And how good are you doing base training? Like if you do a zone 2, a proper zone 2 session, like you do quite often, do a 3-hour zone 2 session with 5 minutes of stops in that 3 hours, constant pressure, minimal time, freewheeling, that's a hard session. That's hard on your muscles. Yeah. So you get to the end of that and you will feel, your legs will feel tired. You may not feel cardiovascularly or respiratory really tired or exhausted, but your legs are like, I'm starting to hurt because I haven't stopped freewheeling for 3 hours. That's hard, and it takes your muscles time to recover from that. If you do a 3-hour ride and you go an hour, I'll stop for coffee for 20 minutes and then do another hour and stop and have some lunch or stop and see someone, or you're freewheeling down hills all the time, then you may be able to do a high intensity session the next day because you're recovering during that session.
Yep.
So how do your base training session look and how effective are you at doing that?
Cool. So there is a place for the longer base rides in a high intensity interval training phase.
100%.